Welcome to the Dragon's Den. I'm your venerable host, Orochi, and today we're going to continue our journey through the impossible lands. We go from the beautiful, intricate, yet deadly lands of Bopan to the very deadly, but also very dead lands of Geb. Now, Geb is the premier land of the dead. It is a nation ruled by undead who hosts undead as their primary citizenship. There are still living people who reside within Geb, but they are a minority. I think it shows a breakdown for each city, and for the capital city, it's something like a 30-60 split with a little bit of other stuff, because they always leave other. But it's primarily undead rule these cities. The interesting part, though, is the way that it goes into depth on how these cities are run from the perspective of, undead ruling them, because of two reasons. First is the undead aren't totalitarian dictatorship. It is a dictatorship, but, not... It's lawful evil. There are laws. That is one of the big things to note in Geb, that they have the dead laws, which were penned hundreds and hundreds of years ago and haven't really been touched since. So they are out of date, but they were written specifically to make it so that the living have a place in Gebite society, not as just food. You can be food because there are a lot of undead who perhaps don't care about the law, as there are in every city on any planet. So it's always a sort of thing where, depending on what undead you piss off, they might curse you, or they might use their political power to ruin your life, or they might just eat you. Like, if a ghoul wants to eat you, they will eat your entire body, and then there will be no evidence that they did anything wrong. Whereas, like, a shadow or a specter or something, they're still going to leave a corpse when they're done, so they're less likely to outright just kill you. So I think that brings a lot of variety to the threats you face for being a living person in a perhaps rather corrupt society, is that based on what kind of creature someone is an entirely different kind of threat they are to you, and also what their station is. Overall, the stations, especially in the capital, are, the creator of the city and the nation, and then the ruling bloodlords, and then their chosen acolytes and all that stuff, all undead, and then down at the bottom are the living. So it's not a great place to be a living person, but it's not like the only opportunity for you there is to be food. That's the the one good thing to take away from Geb is that you could live there and there's a chance you won't be food, which is always a fantastic thing. So we have law and order is one of the higher valued things in this land, especially their cities, which you kind of hope most cities are ran that way because cities that aren't lawful are probably freaking disasters. But knowing that they specifically penned out, you know, the dead laws, it's like their Magna Carta or their Constitution or whatever. You know, it's their, hey, this is the thing we need to make it so that our nation isn't a chaotic clusterfuck and that we have some semblance of order and people know what they're going to be getting into by living here. So that's super awesome. And I don't think you can really point to any other nation and easily see that, you know, this is forefront of everything they're about. Is like, hey, we made these laws, we drafted all this stuff, so this is exactly what you can expect when you come here. So that's super cool. The other big thing to note is that the creator of Geb, Mr. Geb himself, is still around. And he created this nation, I forget how long ago, at least 1,000 years ago. Because he went to war with another great mage, Miss Nex, and they had a long, several hundred-year catastrophic war as two high-level casters who are doing a dick measuring contest would do. And that's exactly what happened. And nobody was better off for it. It was bad for everybody. The big interesting part, for me anyway, about Geb is that you expect a nation of undead to be ruled by a lich. That seems to be the most iconic and most obvious answer, is that, yeah, he was a necromancer. He became a lich, and now he rules over a kingdom. It's like, that's not what happened at all. Not even close. And I find that fascinating. Like, it's so different than what you would expect. And I mean, like, your second expectation, especially if you're interested in like fantasy Warhammer and stuff, and you like the Khemri, is like, oh yeah, there could easily be a mummy in charge of everything. That makes total sense as well. But no, not a mummy. In fact, the story of Geb is really screwed up. His entire history is rather bonkers. But let's see. We have a picture of him. I don't want to get into all this other stuff. So we will find the picture of Mr. Geb. We also have this super awesome art. That's just, that's beautiful. Such dark tones. And I love that the Geb and the people who originally settled here were from Osirian, which is 100% dedicated to ancient Egypt. As you can see in the background here, we have a pyramid. That is, despite the fact that they're like mummies don't hold a significant portion of the population or part of their culture or anything, ancient Egyptian is their like base theme that they were made after. It's like people from Egypt came to this area and then repopulated. So they brought their structures and their themes and stuff with them, but then over the course of well over 1,000 years. That, of course, changed some, but a lot of the construction, especially the center of the primary city of Geb, Mechitar, I'm probably not saying that right, but it was all made 1,000 years ago, so it was very much made in the ancient Assyrian style with pyramids and that sort of stuff. So it's kind of fascinating to think about, so many people using really, really ancient building techniques and themes even in the modern day, because that's what they grew up with, whites and ghouls and stuff that are 1,000 years old. They're like, yeah, this is the way I've always done things. It's like, that's crazy interesting. And how would you mix that up and say, hey, the living have a little bit of pull on introducing new things to this society, but all the powerful people are hundreds, if not thousands of years old, and they're still stuck in really ancient mindsets. So how would those kind of things clash? What sorts of things would happen to bring certain individuals, closer to modern times in certain areas, whereas others still stay back? And how does that mix together? There's so much interesting theming stuff in Geb, where you could just make an entire campaign about just trying to survive these streets, gain power. Well, I mean, that's basically what the Bloodlord's AP is. And I hope to do that AP someday. And if I do, I'll probably make another video on it that's like an update to this one, and try to encourage whatever GM I have at the time for doing that to, think about those sort of things. If they're not suggested in the AP already, I think it would be super interesting to go over those things, just to explore the society some and how different aspects mesh together, because it's crazy interesting. It's just so awesome. And then, where are you? You are... I know there's a picture of him in here. That is the other guy. That is that. The book only goes over 2 major cities, which I think is kind of unfortunate, because it talks about one settlement that I would have loved to have gone and had a lot more detail in, because I find it extremely interesting, but I also find much different things interesting than most. It was just because near the coast there's a coastal settlement that's like half submerged in the water because rising tide or whatever, and the settlement was made many hundreds of years ago, and they have a thriving population of Orochi there, and I think that's awesome, because that's my jam. I think they had a picture of him early in the book, and I had that in the first video I did when just doing an overview of the Impossible Lands. But here we have a little overview, a little roundup. Level 20 settlement, which is always great for your capital. Population 42,000, which is alright. It's much better than the 1,000 for one city. But considering how big and old this city is, I don't know. I feel like that number should be higher. It's hard to extrapolate, like, ancient cities had much lower populations compared to modern cities because people died much younger and more people died from tons of different things. Death was a very common thing because the accidents would easily kill you and murder wasn't exactly uncommon. It's still not sort of today, but with the idea that a fantasy world has magic and you have clerics that can almost mimic modern day medicine, I would say that capital cities should easily be in the hundreds of thousands of population, just like our big cities here in modern day. But that's just, especially with undead. Like, you see the breakdown here: 67% undead, 19% humans, 3% tieflings, 2% half orcs, and 9% other. So 67% of the population can't get sick, can't die from things, can't die from old age. They're always going to be around. And their numbers are only ever going to increase. Well, I guess that's not actually true. I suppose this population depends on how their census determines, is this all undead or intelligent undead? Because in Gab, you specifically, I can't remember now if it was, I think, a recent change in how certain people view the dead laws, and some action has been taken to try and, you know, get certain aspects rewritten. Nothing actually has, but there is a societal shift in the way of thinking about certain things, especially in Metatar, that in the dead laws it says any mortal who dies in Geb forfeits their body. They will be resurrected as undead. Period. No ifs, ands, or buts. If you die in Geb, you've already given consent to have your corpse raised as an undead. And that usually means being raised as a zombie or a skeleton so that you can be part of their workforce, which is like you sort of expect any nation who fully embraces undead that's going to be their workforce. And then that also makes you think, well, all manual labor stuff is done by undead, so what sort of jobs might be available to everybody else if there's no, you know, manual jobs? That's an entire aspect of this culture you could just do a deep dive in a couple sessions to find that sort of stuff out, because that's awesome. So if this is including mindless undead, then yes, that number will fluctuate because mindless undead get wear and tear, and they have checks and balances and processes for, they hire necromancers to do repairs on them, but once they're past the point of they can't be repaired, then they're scrapped. So their numbers will go down, but not anywhere near, I would think, that they go up. But I guess that also depends on it. I don't remember it saying anywhere in here what the societal outlook is, or any of the, like, proper channels or whatever for making other intelligent undead. So you would think, whites and vampires and stuff is like, well, if they want power, they're just going to create progeny left and right so that they have a power base to stand on, right? But who knows? That might be illegal. It's probably in there somewhere that, You have to go through some sort of bureaucracy to create more intelligent undead, or undead at all. They have entire schools, multiple schools, dedicated towards necromancy. So there's bound to be rogue necromancers who are doing illegal stuff. And so it's definitely has to be government regulated. But it's just such interesting stuff. But I won't go too deep into it, but it's sort of ancient history, so I don't feel like I'm spoiling too much here. But the story of Geb is messed up because during the war between Geb and Nex, I don't recall. I need to do another deep review of Nex before I get to that section, but I don't recall it ever saying like what his specialty was, because Geb was also obviously a necromancer, but I think Nex was maybe a conjurer, because, or maybe I'm thinking from making other connections that aren't D&D related, because they have a lot of like elemental people. They subjugated Jin and that sort of stuff. So I think that sounds more like conjuration to me. But we'll get there when we get there. But they had a big fight for hundreds of years. We're throwing armies against each other, all this, that. But then one day, Geb's army pushed forward and made their way into Nex's capital. So that tells you that Geb wins the war, because he assaults Nex's capital, and as they're storming the capital, Nex, I don't know, it'll probably be more clear once I reread in detail that section, but he uses a device, and I think he puts himself in a pocket dimension in like stasis or maybe time travel or something. But he goes into this device that he has made, you know, like the wardrobe where you go to Narnia, that sort of stuff. That's basically what he did. And he disappeared. He ran away, and he hasn't been seen in over 1,000 years. So all it says is that after Nex ran away, Geb gave up the fight and returned to his own capital. It's like, first off, why the fuck would you do that? Why wouldn't you take over the capital of your enemy if you've been fighting them for hundreds of years, sustaining your life through magical means? Like, why the hell would you just give up? Take all of their lands. Like, at least destroy their capital, if not take all of their cities and make all of their land your land. Because then even if they do come back, you can just say, hey, I took everything you owned. All your shit is my shit now. Like, why would you not do that? That boggles my mind. Instead, Geb goes home and then loses his fucking mind. All he can think about is like, oh, Nex is still out there. He could be anywhere. He could be under my bed. Oh my God. And Geb loses his fucking mind. He becomes paranoid, locks himself in his room, and then he fucking kills himself. Like, can you imagine being a ridiculously powerful necromancer with massive armies at your command, having routed your enemy's armies and had the opportunity to sack their city, and then you go home and you're so terrified of this enemy who you beat. You made them run the fuck away that you would kill yourself in fear of what they could do, or the fact that you can't get your victory over them and shove it in their face. Like, I can't even imagine like what sort of neurosis Geb must have had to go down that kind of spiral. This is like one of those things where don't ever take light of suicide, but Geb was a fucking moron. Absolute, so stupid to be so powerful to win the war and then kill yourself because you couldn't secure your victory and kill your arch nemesis. Like, holy crap, dude. Your brain must be so fucking broken at that point. It just, it is so nonsensical. So then you must ask, well, if he died as a necromancer and he did not become a lich and he also did not become a mummy, how the frig is he still around ruling the place? And the answer is he came back as a ghost because his unfinished business, the thing that he killed his own dumbass over. His unfinished business is that he needs to confront Nex and kill him. Could you imagine having killed yourself over this thing, and then that was the reason why your soul is shackled to your home city? He can't even leave his home city because his soul is shackled there until he can somehow send his own agents out to find, capture Nex, and bring him back to Mekatar so that Geb can kill him. Like, that is... Wow. You thought things were bad when you were alive, man. Your dumbass just made it so that you're in your own hell. He is in his own undead hell of his own making. It is phenomenal levels of karmic justice, which is, it's just so hilarious. I'm not sure if that's what the authors were going for, but that's what it is. Just fantastic levels of karmic justice. But Geb hasn't done anything in almost 1,000 years. He doesn't rule his nation. He sort of made the Bloodlords, a few of them, but then being the absolute overpowered piece of shit that he was, he went out and found the Herald of Erodin before Erodin died, because I think Eredin only died a few hundred years ago at most, only a couple, because the current age of Lost Omens is because of Eredin dying somehow. I don't know any of the details of it. I barely piece it together. But, and specifically in Galarian, like, each god apparently has a herald, whether it was a mortal or what used to be outsiders, either fiends or celestials or whatever. They're raised up to celestial or fiend levels and become the immortal heralds of the god. But he took Eredin's herald at the time because I think after, I don't remember her name. Is it on here? I don't think it is because of things that happened. Yeah, it's not on here. But after he takes her, that's when not Saren Ray, but what's her name? The Lawbringer. She became Erodin's herald, and then when he died, she became took his place. She became a god. I think that's how all that worked out. But anyhow, he stole away a herald of a god, killed her, raised her as a... I forget what she is. I think she's a vampire, sort of. Or maybe she's a unique kind of undead because she was a herald. Or no, she's a dread knight. I think she's some sort of dread knight. But anyway, he made her some sort of dread knight and then, bound her to the city of Mekatar and then just said, run my fucking city, goodbye. And then just locked himself away in his room or whatever for 1,000 years. And she's been running the city ever since. But in the coming of the age of Lost Omens, she managed to break Geb's hold and escaped the city. So now it's kind of in unrest because all of the bloodlords that were loyal to her were killed off, and so there's just a monumental power vacuum, and there's tons of bloodlords and perhaps even other factions, since there are quite a number of powerful factions in Mekatar that are all vying for power in the city. So that basically brings us to where we are in Mekatar, and they've constantly tried to become more welcoming to mortals because it all is also a site of massive trade. It's fairly close to the coast. There's a bay near the city, and they funnel the bay into the city and they call it the River of Rot, that comes in and goes around the main structure of it might have been the original whole city, because the city has just constantly expanded over the last 1,000 years, but definitely around Geb's primary stronghold within the city. I think it's called the the Cinerarium, something like that. But ships are constantly coming in. There's massive trade into Mekatar because the country of Geb is beyond a shadow of doubt the highest exporter of food to other countries. No other country produces anywhere near the food that Geb does, and no other country exports like 90% of the food that they make. And that's because, they just have tons of fertile farmland that's harvested day and night by undead, which is crazy awesome. But the Bloodlords and their former leaders specifically made it so that they're exporting all of these goods to other countries that need them, and they're like, hey, we're giving out all of this cool stuff because we're cool people. Come and visit us, and you might like it here. We have society, and we have parties all the time. There's not a whole lot of work unless you're a craftsperson. Like, it's pretty good living here. And so they've just constantly tried to put out this very, very soft, welcoming image to other nations. And so a lot of neutral or perhaps down on their luck countries that are barely able to support their own people do a lot of trade with Geb. And you can tell that, a lot of the more northern, very good aligned countries are like, yeah, there's a country down there of undead. We gotta do a holy crusade and smite that shit someday, but they've got a lot of allies now, and we also have all these other problems going on. We got the Whispering Tyrant bullshit here, and yeah, but there is a nation down there of undead, and that's a bad thing. And I find that fascinating, that they're just putting out this good image to a lot of other places. And I think it would be hilarious if they just kept trying to do that, to actually be, you know, the thing that they show off. Try to be at least neutral. It's a lawful evil settlement, but if they somehow manage to get themselves towards being neutral ish, I mean, they train necromancers and shit, so it's never going to be have any enough good in it to offset the evil. But I love the idea of them just softening their image enough to welcome people in, even as like a tourist trap. It's that is such an interesting perspective. But before we get on to too much, I don't want this to go on forever. But Mechatars, there's so much information about the city here. It is a massive metropolis, even if the numbers kind of don't really say it. But it's sort of like New York in that they built this little city and then they expanded on it and then they expanded on it and then they expanded on it, and that has a lot of problems in and of itself. A lot of cities are technically sort of that way, but I think from what little I know, New York like epitomizes bad design on top of bad design on top of bad design. Well, design with little forethought of becoming bigger. Because that's why that's another whole thing. But yes, it's a crazy interesting city. But that's not the only place we need to talk about, so we will be moving on. So much information. Here we have a map. I'll show this off really quick. Here we have a map. So you get the harbor here, and it goes in towards the River of Rot. And the Cenarium is a massive complex that is Geb's primary hold. He can't really move too much away from that because he's stuck there. But it's got this massive harbor where they have tons of ships coming in. It's very interesting. Then we go to the other primary city. Of Geb, which is Yuled. It's 18th level, so that's still pretty high. And the population here is much larger. These are good numbers. 81% undead, 11% humans, 2% half-elves, 2% half-orcs, 1% fetchling, and 3% other. Which is also a really strange mix of things. That there are, at 2% of 119,000? That means there's at least 2,000 half-elves and 2,000 half-orcs. That's really interesting. Like, how do you get that without having a massive population of orcs and elves somewhere to mix with your humans, right? And I think this is sort of one of those things where, like, they accept these sorts of people more here, so that's where they end up. And Yuled is a military installation, first and foremost. Not really a city. It is a military base turned into a city, but it's still trying to do the thing it was made for. It was made on the front lines of Geb's territory when starting the war against Nex. That's how old this city is. This city is also 1,000 years old, and it has weathered countless attacks, magical and physical, from armies. And so that's what it prepares for every day, to counter any attacks against it, but it's also constantly training to increase its army size, which is basically what this number represents. Like the most of this number is what Geb's primary army is, because they're just constantly training new troops, and there are, what was it, 3 major colleges in Yuled of necromancy. 3 entirely different colleges that specialize in different aspects of necromancy. They get very specific, which is extremely interesting. But this is where you go if you're not a craftsperson and you perhaps want to make a name for yourself. You either somehow become part of the army, or you join one of the schools to learn necromancy. And then also probably become part of the army doing repairs, or part of the agricultural system. There's tons of needs for necromancers in Geb. I also like how they have threats on here. Like, this is all the stuff that you might have a problem with if you try to live here. Undead, yeah. Undead are always just a problem. Military brutality. Good stuff. There's not nearly as much information on Yuled. It's not nearly as big or in-depth, but it goes into what the colleges are like and the sorts of military stuff. And then it goes into the kinds of people who raise in the ranks here, because that's what you're looking for. Oh, it's 4 universities: the Mortarium, the Synostosis, the Shadow Academy, and the Twilight Castrum. So, very interesting. And also, you got to think, with colleges of necromancy around, that means there's tons of students and even professors that are doing necromantic experiments to further the knowledge of necromancy. And that alone is like terrifying shit you can get into. Here we have a map of the city. All very tightly packed. But it is pretty big, as all of Geb's cities are constantly just expanding because their numbers don't go down as fast as regular cities. But it goes into the important people that live there. And then we move on to the Geb-specific rules, which all of these things can be found in Path Builder. But I was kind of disappointed with most of this stuff. When you're talking about necromancy, you'd think, oh, there's going to be some magic or magical items and stuff, but it's mostly just curses, which makes sense that, you know, undead who have been around a long time know how to do, you know, some nasty ritual magic and some curses and shit, because they can't just outright kill you all the time. They need other methods of punishing people, and also just to be, you know, methods of coercion. It's like, oh, hey, I have this powerful curse I could put on you if you don't do exactly what I tell you to, because you looked at me wrong. Then we got catalysts, which are just components that give additional effects, which I think are, don't know if this is the first place catalysts have shown up. I think it is. It might be something that they were also planning to expand more on the treasure book that's coming out next year. But I find these are the sorts of things that should be like all over the damn place, because a lot of players, in my experience, don't really want to use material components for their spells because it doesn't really offer anything. Like, some of the stuff is cool every once in a while to, ham up using your spell components and stuff because it makes it look, especially if you are a lower level or whatever, and you need to do spells in very specific ways. You have to place the components in a certain, style and all that kind of stuff. It's like low tier kind of magic. Not just low level, but like if you're doing a low magic kind of campaign, then your magic looks sort of like science. And if you present it that way, then spell components can be really interesting and add a lot more to your role play and stuff. But mechanically, it's just clunk. It's just clutter and doesn't need to exist. But spell catalysts will specifically be the kind of thing where it's like, oh yeah, I can cast this spell whenever I want, but if I add this extra thing to it, it becomes a lot cooler. I haven't gone over any of these in detail, so they're probably pretty freaking weak. Like this one's level 10, so mid-range, 200 gold, which isn't too much, but I don't consume. I hate consumables. I just really, really hate consumables. Like most of them are so weak compared to what you want to save up money for that I don't think it's ever a good idea to buy most consumables. This one, activate it. The vengeful wails of a revenant barely contained in this rattling jar infuse your magic with all of their spite and malice. If a target fails its saving throw against your Seal Fate spell after you've added this catalyst, it takes 1d6 persistent damage. Well, it's persistent damage, so that's decent, but 1d6 at level 10 is pretty terrible, and it's only after a fail save. I'm gonna say that's garbage, absolute garbage. It needs to always do something. Even if somebody critically saves against your spell, if you're using a catalyst, the catalyst should do something. You're adding money to this. So if you're adding 200 gold to any of your spells, if the enemy saves or critically saves, then you've literally just thrown money onto the ground and lost it. Like, that's not good. That's bad design. I'm going to say that out loud. That's just bad design. So these sort of things should always do something. I think if you add, homebrew catalysts with either some of the grimoires that have already been introduced, or hopefully there'll be a bunch new grimoires in the treasure book, or just make your own. I've played in previous campaigns where somebody, I don't know where they got the idea from, but it was either an anime or a book series or something they read, but it was all about grimoires being powerful, and that sort of was the crux of his magic system that he had made in his campaign. And I think that kind of thing is awesome. So I would say, yeah, get catalysts and grimoires and do anything you can to make spellcasters better and more interesting and more reliable in the things that they do. And yes, also more powerful. Because I will constantly keep saying I think spellcasters are really weak. They're not to the point where it's pointless to play them, but if you play in power groups, with fighter, barbarian, champion, and a rogue, if you play in a group like that, all combat is going to be a cakewalk. No matter what you go against, combat will be a cakewalk. And then all you need is a rogue to handle your skill stuff, and that's basically it. There's nothing that a spellcaster would bring to the table that isn't at some level already taken care of. So I definitely think buff spellcasters, and these are cool things that do that. But I would probably say make your own better ones. But I think that's one of the great things with, you know, like with relics. Like once they introduce the idea to you and give you a few options so that you can get like a base idea of how these sort of things are supposed to work, then you can make your own and have them still be fairly balanced and know, how far you can scale them up before they're obviously unbalanced. We got some magical items here, which is always fantastic because we definitely need more magical items. I have not looked at these in depth, but magical items are usually much more interesting than consumables. So definitely go check these out. And look, we got pictures. That looks, yeah. And that is the end of this one. And next, as you can see right here, we're going into Jalmari, and then the Manoways, and finally we will be touching on Nex. Be a little unfortunate that Nex is so far removed from Geb since they're so intricately tied, but we'll get there. Next one's going to be very interesting. I do like a lot of the flavors in Jalmari. I didn't think I would when I first saw their stuff, but yeah, I like it. But that is it for now. Have a great evening.